Card grading. It was a booming service in the UK during lockdown after the news of PSA temporarily closing down. Everyone was opening up a grading service. Opportunists did, resellers did, hardcore collectors did, PSA middlemen did, I did, and maybe even you did. But what's actually involved in grading? I mean, we all sort of know the basics, don't we? I'm going to help answer some of those burning questions that you've asked about what's really involved behind closed doors at a grading company. Let's go! So, as I mentioned, I run a grading company, and I've loved every minute of the last year, seeing everyone's cards come through our doors, building this amazing community. You can see more about us opening up in this video when we officially launched. We'd asked on Instagram and Discord what are some of the grading myths or questions that you want answered. Before we start, I feel like I have to say we'll try and be as fair and unbiased as possible, as we have been customers of a lot of other grading companies, and our opinions are just our opinions. I shouldn't have to say, but this is the internet. Some of the things I'm going to say are just jokes. Okay? So, let's get started. Okay, first question was, why is UV protection important at all? That's a great question, and clearly was asked as a way for us to bump up our slabs, thank you. UV light is what can damage your cards and make them fade over time. Just take a look at this poor Charizard, for example. Presumably it was just left out on display next to a window for a really, really long time. That's not what you want to have happen to your collectibles over time. Obviously, if you just store them away for safekeeping, that you're not going to have that issue. But the problem is twofold with this. First, these slabs are made from a plastic called polystyrene, which has very little UV resistance. Same as the card just being left out without a case, really. The second is, why would you leave it on display for that long without noticing it starting to fade? All the slabs in this PSA style that you see on the market are all made of the same material. We've done tests on the Ace slab, the original one before they updated it. Beckett, CGC, those slabs are polystyrene. So just keep that in mind if you're choosing a slab with the intention of it being on display for a long period of time. We use acrylic, which is a far superior UV resistance. Nothing is perfectly UV resistant, should go without saying. To save time and to go into all the science of it, look at these two cards that we left in the sun for a few weeks, very much in the style of a Deep Pocket Monsters video. I shouldn't need to explain the difference. Next question. Does each slab design / material need to be a different frequency on the welding machine? Yes, it does, but the intention is to just melt a very thin line of plastic by vibrating it. The machine will have to compensate for thickness and material around that thin line. So if it's a very thick material, even metal, then it would have to vibrate longer and harder to be able to melt it. Hope that answers the question. Let's go on to the next one. Is it necessary to use a plastic sleeve when you're about to use the welding machine? No, it is not necessary, but it is recommended, as the horn that vibrates is just a big block of metal. This means that it could potentially chip or rub the plastic, especially if it's cheap polystyrene. So having a plastic sheet used as a buffer to separate direct contact can really help avoid those sort of issues. I have seen some companies use those little plastic bags that the slabs are shipped in. Personally, I wouldn't recommend that because they can crinkle and fold over, making some welds weaker than others, because just like in the last question, you have to account for the added thickness, like how much is in between the welding horn and the welding joint. So if you have a crumpled up plastic bag, that could weaken the joint. Next question. Do you handle the cards submitted with gloves? Yes, is the simple answer to that one. While it is safe to say that well-washed hands are fine. You don't wear gloves when you're opening up packs, do you? But if someone is paying for a service, then you best put some effort in, really. You've been sent this video from another grading company a lot of times, and it's a prime example, especially if you're making a video for the public, promoting your services. Just put gloves on. It stops getting fingerprints on the label too if you've got a high gloss or a foil label. Just doesn't need it. Follow up to that question. I would avoid these sort of gloves, like the plague. You cannot feel the card. You're always dropping very small fibres that will only end up on the slab. People only ever use these gloves for photo shoots to make stuff look more professional. Nobody grades with these gloves. They are ridiculous. The best sort of gloves to use are these ones, typically used by tattoo artists. They're nice and tight, they have no chemical residue on them, and they just work. Next question. What is the difference using a top loader and a semi-rigid, and which ones are better for you and why? Personally, I prefer top loaders. Even better if you put a pull tab on them, but honestly, either is fine. So some will complain about one or the other, and some will cut into them because they don't understand how this works. I don't know. Personally, top loaders, either is fine. What is the average time spent per card to determine the grade? That's a great one. So I see this a lot online as criticisms to some UK companies, and I've seen it quite heavily on CGC. The general consensus is that grading companies have to spend like a minimum of 20 minutes, half an hour, or even more to warrant paying for a service. Personally, for us, it ranges depending which type of card you send. It takes longer if you send a non-holographic Pokemon card than it would a textured VMAX Pokemon card. The reason for that is the textures are a lot easier to work around and to see any imperfections when working under a UV light. A non-holographic card just requires tons of light at different angles at different times to see any scratches. It is a nightmare if it is an electric energy type card as well, because it's just so hard to pick up on the scratches. Honestly, dig out some commons, try and scratch them loosely, and do the same with an electric type. It's just so much harder. Majesty Grading Company actually said in an interview with Sam's Gotta Catch 'Em All, who does a really good podcast on all of the grading companies. You're yet to interview us, dude, but I hope the invite's coming. Where they commented on how quickly PSA must look at cards. So we decided to actually try and compare numbers across grading companies to see how long you actually spend on a card. At the time of that interview, PSA had graded 800,000 cards, which is a lot of cards. They have 1,000 employees, which works out that you'd assume 800 cards per person. Obviously not each member of staff is necessarily grading, but work with me here. Times that by 12 to find their yearly average, and divide by 52 to find the weekly. That's 184.6 cards graded in a week, which is 36.92 cards graded in a day, which works out at roughly 5 cards an hour. Obviously there's so much more involved in terms of grading, printing a label, encapsulating, quality control checks, packaging, and then posting it back to the customer. But if we just hold that as the standard of that's what PSA are doing. That works out at 67 cards a day, 9.69 cards an hour, nearly 10 cards an hour. I mean, no comment. Obviously this is just using basic maths. By that logic, we've only done 1,000 grades in just under a year, so that would mean that we're spending way too long on cards. Aside from that little ramble, the amount of time spent looking at a card is only realistically between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on the type of card. I'd be willing to put money on it, that no other grading company will deny that, which is one of the reasons why I don't think many grading companies have actually stepped up and joined in that conversation. When you see people online saying, oh, this company only spends X amount of time looking at a card and that's a bad thing, because they all know that realistically it doesn't take that long. Arguably, more time is spent in the rest of the grading process, so the labels, the slabbing, uploading to the database, uploading grading reports, packaging, shipping it off. All of that is more time than the actual time spent looking at the cards. Next question. What is the cost of running a sonic welder? The main cost in terms of electric would actually be the air compressor used to move the piston up and down. So choosing a good quality compressor would be the most important thing. You know, I don't think it's very much at all to run the actual welding side, as it only sends a high frequency vibration for 0.25 seconds at a time. If you want to know the exact cost of running an industrial sized vibrator, you should ask your mum. Should ask your mechanic. Are all sonic welders the same, or do you have to buy one specific to your slab? Most of the sonic welders are the same design. The only bits that you would have to buy or have made for your specific slab is the size of the welding horn. It just needs to cover the entire size of whatever it is that you're welding. And to keep things safe and consistent, you can have what's called a cradle made for your slab. Again, it's not required. I know that Beckett just put the slab down on a flat plate and the horn comes down, but it's very useful to keep the slab in the exact same place for consistent welding. The next question is, what is the timescale on slab design if you're going for a unique slab mold rather than an Alibaba PSA style slab? It's quite hard to give a specific answer on timescale. I mean, that's like asking an artist, when is a painting finished? For us, it essentially took us, I'd say, about 6 or 7 months of back and forth between our 3D designer and the moulding company. We would send our designs off, they'd get made, we'd forward them on to the mould company. They would say, oh, you need to amend this, that, the other. They'd send it back to us and we'd forward it back. A lot of the reason for ours taking so long is because we all have full-time jobs, and this was our after-hours project. Early days we could only spend about 2 hours to 3 hours a night working on it and trying to move things forward. It was a very slow process, but someone who knows what they're doing and is really well versed in 3D design programs could quite easily get it done, I would say, in about a week. And then just updating themselves with the knowledge of what's required for something to be ultrasonically welded together and implementing that into their design, it shouldn't take very long realistically. Why is it not okay to have a one-size-fits-all slab for cards? That's the main reason that we made our own slab. We'd tested out those PSA style slabs back in the beginning. We weren't madly impressed how much the card moved. Yes, it allowed you to fit the biggest cards like tops, and you could potentially put a Yu-Gi-Oh card in there, but ultimately it's not great for the card. The reason for it to be important to have a slab tailored to the card that it's going to be housing and keep it secure is ultimately if you were to score a 10 on a Dark Magician card, but it goes into a slab that's made for Pokemon cards, it's not going to be a 10 for very long. A great video to check out is Deep Pocket Monster's slab rattle machine, which is something that we actually replicated when designing our slab. Pat, call me. You don't reply to any of my messages. Come on, man. Granted, in that video, it doesn't show wrong-sized cards in slabs. It does show why it's important to have the slab be made for a specific shape card. Okay, so what is your opinion on posting on socials about cross-grading from other grading companies, and if it's seen as a negative or a positive? So, cross-grades upset everyone. Let's be real for a minute. Nobody thinks that PSA are actually the best at inspecting your card. No one thinks they have the best slab. No one thinks they use the best materials, or really have the best reputation. The reason people will defend them and call you an idiot for cross-grading a PSA 10 is because they have the largest catalogue of graded cards, which means people, customers, you, have an invested interest. So as it begins to be widely accepted as the norm that everyone cross-grades from PSA, then that means your cherished collection is inherently worthless. People have got to justify their purchases. It's a lot like the whole PlayStation versus Xbox argument when you think about it. Neither one technically is better than the other, but because you've paid a lot of money for this plastic box, you're going to die on the hill that says this plastic box is better than your plastic box. This one is a brilliant question. Why does pack fresh not always mean that you're gonna score a 10? Now the sad thing is that I shouldn't have to explain this one, but it does happen a lot. Things are out of your control when you buy a booster pack. straight from the factory. There is centering problems. The print quality could be low, causing hollow bleed. The corners, which are probably the worst with Pokemon at the minute. The cuts often leave them slightly squared or a little bit lifted. Print lines, where essentially the sheets moving along the rollers and the conveyor belts just get a little bit of dirt or dust on them, and they slide over and you get those lovely, lovely lines. So don't just sleeve a card that you've pulled fresh from a pack thinking, it's safe, it's a 10, guaranteed. Look it over. And let us know if you'd like to see a real deep dive on how to pre-grade your cards, because I'd really be into that. So ultimately, when you're buying online and you hear the term pack fresh, think of that more as a historical moment in the card's life rather than any indication on its condition. It's like the card being born. Okay, next question. Not directed at PCG, just in general, as I see it quite a bit regarding grading equals high resale, as some companies advertise this solely. Okay. I've made my stance on value pretty well known across our socials and Discord. I personally don't think that grading should 5x, 10x a card's value. It should solidify it for sure. But why would it matter that a card is in a plastic slab with a label and a number from one company or another? Especially given that PSA think that this is a 10. This was a cross grade that someone had sent in to us, and we were not best impressed. We felt bad. It didn't get a 10 with us, I'm afraid. We've got a whole blog post asking deeper about the herd mentality of PSA's value. But at the end of the day, you should only pay what something is worth to you. Don't go by eBay's last solds, because something is not worth what the last person paid for it. Nobody can tell you the value of a graded card. It's completely subjective. Maybe they can tell you the value of it to them, sure, but not to you. So, as for the using graded means more value to advertise, I mean, taking that at face value, that's just a pyramid scheme, isn't it? You give me money, and I will make you more money. And if we get enough people doing it, we will all believe that we have increased value so that we can sell to each other. That's stupid, that's a false market. Don't buy into that logic. Only pay what you want to pay. Why do companies use the hype of value to try and get more grades? Very similar to the previous question, because they like money, is the best way to put it. The best way to make money is to tell people that you're going to help them make money. That reminds me, I ordered a book online called How to Make Money Selling Fake Books Over the Internet, and it hasn't arrived yet. What is the hardest part of grading a card and why? For me, the hardest part is because I've got to know, I would say 99% of our customers I have had at least one conversation with on Instagram, on Discord. I love hanging out with all of you. And that's what makes it so hard when people send us their cards and I want so bad for them to be good, but we've spotted something that maybe they didn't, and then we send it back and they're like, oh, I thought this was a good one. And it just breaks my heart. Like, I'm laughing, but that's the hardest part. I know the question is probably what's the difficult part of inspecting a card. I don't think there's any real difficulty in inspecting a card. It's all about having the right light, the right eye for it, and making sure that you're not tired when you do it. Honestly, as soon as you feel that slight strain in your eyes, that's when you need to stop. You can let so much slip with that. It doesn't sound too serious, but trust me, that's the turning point where we have to put down everything and say, look, I'm too tired, didn't get enough sleep last night, I can't genuinely look at these cards. Okay, what is the difference between welding and gluing? We see this confusion the most, actually. A lot of people have told us stories about glue being visible on some companies' slabs. What you're typically seeing is the welding joint, that thin bit of plastic that's heated up, vibrated and melted that makes the two parts stick together. I've worked in a stone kitchen worktop company for long enough to tell you that joins will never be invisible. You are literally welding two bits of plastic together. You're going to see a join if you look for it. Naturally, we try to make it as consistent or inconspicuous as possible, but it will never be invisible. Okay, why do some companies hold such high regards of themselves and claim lots of value, yet all you see is negativity about them? I can't say I know exactly which company you're referring to, but I would imagine that it's better than giving up. You know, at the end of the day, all these companies are run by people who I would imagine are trying to make a name for themselves. Everyone falls, everyone makes mistakes. Sure, it's fun to have a little giggle at people's mistakes. God knows we've made some, but I think it's important to have realistic expectations with some of these things. Okay, next question. What are your pet peeves in the grading scene? There's a few. It's mainly, I think, just my OCD, really. It's to do with the grammar that's used or abbreviations on the labels. It just comes down to people copying PSA again, I think. The classic one is using P.M on the label instead of just writing Pokemon. And even in the rare case that they write Pokemon, they never put that little apostrophe, and that just tweaks me a little bit. AI grading, just that as a question. Absolute nonsense. We'd looked into it when we were starting out. Realistically, the only way that a computer can grade your cards for you is if it has a record of every single card in existence in its perfect condition to reference. AI grading typically means it goes into a special scanner that has multiple different light waves that it can view the card in, and then a person still has to look at the results. AI grading is just a buzzword. Personally, it just annoys me. Why do they charge more if the value of the card is higher? Presumably you are referring to PSA because they like money, and because they've built up this massive company that they know people will continue to submit to them, they know they can get away with it. Grading is pointless since you can just regrade and hope to get a higher grade. I mean, yeah, you can always hope to get a higher grade, but ultimately if the card is in bad condition, it's in bad condition. We have seen in multiple instances where people resubmit to PSA many times, like this one. And yeah, I mean, sure, but they're the best and they know what they're talking about. What do you think of PokerGrade's new slab? Without actually having it in my hands, mad props for actually taking that jump. It's super hard to do, especially if they build up this community of people who are so familiar with, I would say, the PokerGrade slab, that PSA style slab. Honestly, I think every grading company should have their own unique product, because without that, your product is a copy of PSA's slab, a copy of PSA's grading scale. The only thing new that you're offering would be a label. And the amount of times that we hear grading companies bang on about their labels, it's like, you're a grading company, not a label company. Maybe bang on about how good your grading is. But back to the slab. I like it. It's smaller, it's compact, not as small as ours. I'm personally more of a fan of pointed corners, but the fact that they've gone for a big rounded corner, it's more like an iPhone kind of thing. That's cool, it's unique, they've done a good job. How has the PCG Journey been as an overall experience so far, and what is the goal for the future? It's been a roller coaster. I'm honestly humbled every day by the amazing cards that people send us. And not even just the cards. We've received so many gifts and messages that it knocks us off our feet when people feel like they want to send us something. The amount of times that I've received messages from people on Instagram and they say, oh, so-and-so's selling a Nidoking. And I just love the fact that people see Nidokings and go, oh, George at PCG might like that. It's lovely. I've actually got a folder upstairs filled with letters and cards that people have just sent to me, and honestly that's been my favourite bit. Even if we were to end and close shop tomorrow, it has been the most wholesome journey. The flip side of that is that the grading industry as a whole is pretty toxic. People will die on their hill defending their grading company of choice. And I mean, more power to you. I don't care who you grade with. For me, the message that I would rather push is that you demand better from your grading company of choice. Insist that they use acrylic. We took the time to actually investigate on Alibaba, where everyone buys those PSA style slabs, and the majority of them give you the option of acrylic or polystyrene. Yes, some will have a slight price increase, maybe making it 25p instead of 20p, but as the customer, ask for that. Some of the options that we found said that there were no differences in the price between having polystyrene or acrylic, so it's a no-brainer. You should also demand publicly accessible grading reports. Don't put them behind a paywall if the information has already been recorded and already there. The whole point of the UK having a grading scene is that we want to separate ourselves from PSA, because they are not the almighty gods that they're made out to be. Make something unique, do it better than PSA, and make it as accessible to everyone as possible. I think also it would be worth asking them to stop copying the PSA marketing style, grading scale, and lack of transparency. I get it. When you start a grading company, of course you're going to look at PSA on how to do things. We did in the first few months when we were starting this journey, but I don't think enough of them look at PSA on how to not do things either. At the end of the day, we don't need a UK PSA. We need something better than that. And the goals for the future, like we mentioned about having the correct size slabs, we have our Yu-Gi-Oh slabs inbound today. That's our next step. After that, I'd really like to get into video game grading, but that's a whole nother journey, and we will see.